Alrighty, we're going to do this again. I'm so sorry that the last video got screwed up in the formatting. For some reason, the ethics one went through for my ethics class, and I recorded them back to back, so I don't know what happened. But anyway, I'm going to do this one over, and if this one is screwed up, then I don't know. Like, you win, world. So, anyway, I'm going to go very quickly. I'm going to move over a lot of stuff. I'm only going to do this. This will be the second and last Kant lecture. And then what I'll do is I'll send some supplementary material through Blackboard. I'll upload it so that you have something, because I am going to move very quickly over some very complicated philosophy. So I'm going to give you some supplementary material through Blackboard, upload it there so that you have something to follow along with. Or after you've watched it, then maybe that'll fill in the blanks. You guys are adults. You know how to use supplementary material. So anyway, so that's going to be the plan. I apologize for that, but here we are. Okay, so remember, Kant's project is fundamentally, or at least one of the fundamental concerns for Kant is, on the one hand, he wants to agree with Hume that all knowledge comes to us through sense experience, right? No one is sort of comes out the chute with knowledge of mathematics or the existence of a mind-independent world or something like that. So, excuse me. So Kant agrees with Hume that in order to learn or know anything, in reality, you have to have sense experience. He disagrees with Hume, however, that knowledge of the mind-independent world is impossible. Remember, he wants to preserve the possibility for science, for instance, and morality, right? Those seem to be his two primary concerns, as I suggested earlier in my last lecture. And so he's got to figure out a way to sort of to maneuver through these shoals, right? And he's sort of guiding a boat through dangerous waters as it is. So that's the goal. Now, the way he's going to do it is by making a distinction that he thinks Hume failed to make. This is at the very end of the introduction of the Prolegomena. So if you look there, he sort of lays it out a little bit. And I will upload a visual for you. It's like a Punnett square, if you remember Punnett squares from your biology classes, either in high school or in college. Only instead of genetics, it's sort of like a taxonomy of types of belief or types of judgments. That's Kant's word, and justifications of those judgments. So, if we go back to Hume, remember Hume took more or less all beliefs that we have, or what Kant would call judgments, and breaks them into two primary species, right? On the one hand, matters of fact. On the other hand, we have relations of ideas. And remember, relations of ideas were things like mathematical truths, logical truths, geometry, things like this, and the inferences drawn from them. All relations of ideas for Hume are they can fundamentally rather be proved deductively. Which means, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. It's truths that are necessitated by the conclusions and the inferences drawn from them. They are true by definition, right? Remember, I gave you that big fancy word, tautological, right? So Hume thinks that even the most complicated math can redound to fundamentally claims that are true by definition, right? And you can sort of see. It's easy to forget that when we say and the word equation, right? It's got the word equal right in there, right? So basically, he thinks all mathematical claims redound to A equals B, right? Well, what does equals mean there, right? It's the same as, right? Or is, or something like that. So to say A is B is to equate them, is to say that they're the same thing. And so Hume thinks all mathematical judgments, judgments of logic, things like this, are fundamentally true by definition. And because they're necessary, right, Hume suggests that these are things that he uses a fancy Latin phrase that I didn't really cover in class because I didn't want to really go into it until we got to Hume. A priori, right? So that's A space Priori, a priori, which is a word I'll get to in a second. Okay, then relations of ideas. These are all other judgments or beliefs about that are not mathematical or logical in nature. Beliefs about the mind-independent world, cause and effect, things like this. You'll recall for Hume, these are the things we can't know, right? Because of his problem of induction, which then leads, he thinks, to his problem of cause and effect, or at least the problem of induction in conjunction with the fact that we only come to know things through experience, leads to the problem of cause and effect, namely that we don't experience it and we can't use induction to justify it. And then from this, he gets to his skepticism about the mind-independent world, right? Because whenever you have an experience from which you form a judgment, you're hearing my voice right now, that's an experience from which you form the judgment that I must be speaking into a microphone, that I exist, that there's somebody here actually talking to you, these sorts of things. And because Hume suggests there's a causal relationship there, and because of the problems with cause and effect, rather than suggesting we know that you're hearing my voice, rather all we can say is that you've been habituated by nature, by the sort of the constitution of our psychological structure to form that belief, and form it very strongly. I mean, you couldn't deny it, at least not without betraying a pathology, and yet we can't claim to know it, right? Okay, and so although Hume doesn't use this term, these are what we would call, and certainly what Kant's going to call, it's another fancy Latin phrase, posteriori, right? So A space P-O-S-T E-R-I O-R-I, posteriori. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not going to spell it. I don't have it in front of me. But you should hear the word posterior in there, right? Like the posterior, something that is following after something else, right? So we've got a priori. You should hear the word prior in there, and then a posteriori, posterior. Okay, so that's the Humean framework, and it's right here where Kant thinks Hume has failed to make a further distinction. Now, what Hume calls relations of ideas, Kant is going to call an analytic judgment. Again, I'll set all this up for you as a supplement uploaded to Blackboard, so you'll see this Punnett square on paper. I apologize. I mean, in the last one I had a whiteboard here and I was writing it all out, but I didn't have it here. I was actually up in my kids' playroom, and it took me like over an hour to clean the darn thing, and then the video didn't load, and then the kids are kids, so it got messy, and I was like, okay, anyway, so I will have this all for you, and it will be uploaded, so you will be able to see it as I'm explaining it, because I know this is going to be tough without having a visual cue. Okay. So, what Hume called relations of ideas, Kant's going to call analytic judgments. And what Hume called matters of fact, Kant's going to call synthetic judgments. So whereas Hume equated relations of ideas with a priori cognition, Kant is going to Hume has relations of ideas as a priori, and then on the other hand, matters of fact as a posteriori. So that there's a symmetric relationship there, right? You see, it's a one-to-one. Well, Kant's going to suggest that you can branch that out. So you've got analytic ideas and synthetic ideas at the top of the Punnett square, and then on the side you're going to have a priori and a posteriori, right? So there are going to be 4 squares instead of just 2 for the Humean picture. So this is the distinction Kant thinks Hume failed to make. Now, why does Kant not use relations of ideas? I mean, I don't know, but the reason he calls them analytic is because he thinks that with Hume, he agrees with Hume that all, not all. He's going to disagree with Hume that everything Hume considers a relation of idea is actually analytic. He's going to deny that. But he does recognize that there are certain propositions such that if you analyze the terms of the proposition, you will see that they're true by definition. That's why he calls them analytic, right? So you can determine the truth of a proposition, of an analytic proposition, merely by analyzing the terms within the proposition itself. You don't have to go out and do any field research in order to justify the claim. Rather, all you have to do is understand all the terms in the proposition and analyze it to see whether the terms sort of form a tautology or fail to, right? So the example Kant gives is all bachelors are unmarried males, which is why I use that example so often in class, right? Once you understand the definition of what a bachelor is, you recognize that they must be all, once you understand what the definition of a bachelor is, then you don't need to go out and do field research, interviewing and surveying and polling all unmarried males to see whether they are in fact bachelors, right? You just know by definition, if someone says, hey, my name's Stephen, I'm a bachelor, then you know that he's an unmarried male. Or likewise, if someone says, hey, I'm Stephen, I'm looking for the one, I can't wait to get married and start having kids, then you know that he's a bachelor, right? So that's what he means by analytic propositions. Now, synthetic propositions are propositions whereby you cannot merely analyze the terms of the proposition, determine their truth value. You actually have to go out and look in the world to determine the truth or falsity of the proposition. So an example Kant uses is something like all bodies have weight, something like that. Another analytic proposition for Kant is that all bodies are extended. So he uses all bachelors are unmarried males. He also uses all bodies are extended. Because it's true by definition, right? What is something to be a body other than that it's got extension in three-dimensional space, right? Even if it's very, very small, like a point. You barely touch the tip of a pen to paper, right? Well, that thing's still expanded in three-dimensional space, right? It's got width, it's got breadth, and it's got depth, even if it's very small. It's even got depth, right, on the page. The ink's got to soak down. That's why we use paper to write on, right? The ink's got to get soaked into something so that it sticks, right? This is why whiteboards work. You can wipe them off because they can't really get down in there very far. Okay, anyway, so Kant takes it as definitionally true that anything that is a body, and again here we don't just mean like the human body, we mean like geometric patterns or shapes or anything like that. So it's true by definition that all bodies have shape. It's not true by definition, Kant thinks, that all bodies have weight, because again, analyze the term of the proposition. What is a body? Well, it's something that's got or is extended in 3 dimensions. Okay, it has extension maybe because perfect geometric figures sort of theoretically don't have a 3rd dimension. They just have width and breadth. They don't have depth. But anyway. But there's nothing about that suggests that all bodies have weight, right? I mean, because weight is an additional concept, right? And it has to do with actually a whole lot of other complicated things, like gravity, for instance, and mass, and all these things. So it's not necessarily the case that you can just deduce by analysis of the terms of the proposition that bodies have weight within them. Rather, what you have to do is go out into the world and pick things up, right? And sort of read Newton and this sort of thing, right? So that's going to require experience. Okay. So this is if you're looking at Punnett Square, you've got the analytic, synthetic, right? So we've got at least one analytic, one synthetic. Now we come down here, right? All analytic propositions for Kant are going to be a priori. So you can sort of check off that first box. Yes, it is true that all analytic propositions are going to be justified a priori. Also, now, are some synthetic propositions justified a priori? We'll bracket that. I mean, spoiler alert, the answer is yes, and this is precisely where he thinks Hume has gone wrong. He thinks Hume has falsely concluded that only analytic propositions are justified a priori, and Kant thinks no, some synthetic propositions are justified a priori as well. Okay. So now we go to the bottom left-hand corner. Are there any analytic propositions that are justified a posteriori? No. Kant thinks that's just a confused understanding, right? Because, and again, I'm going to explain what a priori and a posteriori mean in a moment, but fundamentally Kant's going to suggest no, because if something is true by analytically true, then that just means all you need is an analysis of the terms themselves. You don't need any further justification than merely understanding the terms of the proposition. And then we have synthetic a posteriori. These are like the relations of ideas, or rather, what Hume took to be all matters of fact. Lots of synthetic things. Again, that is, by definition, propositions that require further exploration beyond the mere terms of the proposition. They have to be justified beyond just a mere, not just a mere analysis, but they're the sorts of things that you always have to go out and discover using your sensation, using your five senses in order to justify. Okay, so what is a priori and a posteriori? There's a lot of confusion on this, and there, especially since about the 1920s. I won't go into the history of it, but with a group of philosophers called the Vienna Circle, which led to a form of sort of a philosophical school called logical positivism. And then a guy named W.V.O. Quine, who sort of responds to the logical positivists. And I'm not getting into the whole history, but there's a lot of confusion over what a posteriori and a priori mean. So the fundamental distinction is this. The question is, if you make if you make a claim, you form a proposition, X is the case, right? I think that X, or I believe that X, or I judge X to be true, something like that. And someone asks, how can you justify that claim, right? Well, there are, at least according to Kant, two ways of justifying it. You can justify it in an a priori way, or maybe a way of saying it is you can be justified by virtue of the nature of the proposition itself being justified in an a priori way, or it is justified in an a posteriori way. Okay, so a priori means it is a proposition that can be justified without any further relevant experience. Okay, and I'll go to the examples to say what this all means. A posteriori is a proposition that can only be justified by further relevant experience. That is to say, a proposition that is justified a priori or a posteriori requires further justification in order for the truth claim to be justified. I'll just say it without making it circular. So what are some examples? Okay. Well, again, all analytic propositions are true a priori, so all bachelors are unmarried males, right? It is, like I suggested, you not only can know the truth of that by mere analysis of the terms, but moreover, you don't need any further experience than the experience of learning the definitions of the terms themselves, right? So to learn terms, you have to hear them, you have to probably read them, you have to hear someone's explaining them to you, you probably have to read someone's explaining to them, whatever, right? So you have to first pick up these terms, but once you have the terms and you analyze the proposition and you determine that it's analytically true or analytically false, that is true by definition or false by definition, you need no further justification beyond that, okay? So again, once you learn the definition of what a bachelor is, and someone comes up to you, and in sort of the course of conversation, you figure out, that he's unmarried. Maybe he says, "Hey, I hope you don't mind. Your sister's pretty cute. Would you mind if I asked her out?" and you go, yeah, no, you seem like a cool guy. You're not married, right? Just make sure, like, yeah, I'm not going to hook my sister up with a guy who's, cheating on the sly. And he goes, no, I'm not married. Okay, well, that's it, right? You don't need to then go out and be like, okay, so I just a few more questions for you. Are you a bachelor, right? You don't need to do that, right? There's no further justification once you understand the proposition, or the terms of the proposition. Okay. Another example of things that are justified a priori are mathematical propositions, right? Once you learn that the ratio of the circumference of a circle and the diameter of the circle is 3.14 blah, 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 it's pi. Once you know that, then anytime someone draws a perfect circle on a Euclidean plane, you don't need to get out your protractor, or your compass or whatever, and do the really sophisticated calculations to figure out that the diameter between the circumference and the diameter is 3.14 blah 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 blah. Right? You just don't need to do that. Once you understand the definition, once you understand the nature of a single circle, and you learn that because of the nature of circles, this has to be the case, then you don't have to go out and search every other possible circle of every other possible circumference to know that for every circle, the diameter, or rather the ratio of the circumference and the diameter will be 314, blah, 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 blah. Right? This is also true of triangles, right? Every triangle on a Euclidean plane will have inner angles that sum to 180 degrees. Now, once you prove that, and it's pretty, it's something you could do in 10th grade. Historically, it was quite complicated to prove, but once you're taught that, then you know that any triangle that has ever been made, perfect triangle on a Euclidean plane, and every triangle that is yet to be made, perfect triangle on a Euclidean plane, that all of their inner angles, their three inner angles, will sum to 180 degrees. You just know that. In other words, you don't have to go and look at the next triangle and go, oh, okay, now I know. Now I can justify the claim that this triangle has an inner sum of 180 degrees, or the inner angles sum to 180 degrees, okay? You don't have to do that, because that's just not the way mathematics works, right? The whole point is that once you learn, as it were, mathematical laws, then you're justified in making claims, universal claims, categorical claims about all triangles, about all circles or rectangles, etc. Right? That's what it means to be justified a priori. Okay. Now, notice it doesn't mean that there's no experience involved at all. Again, you had to learn these laws of geometry, these laws of mathematics, arithmetic, algebra, and so forth. You did have to learn those, and that requires experience. Kant's not going to deny that. What he's going to suggest, though, is once you learn it, you can be justified in making further claims without recourse to additional experience, right? Okay. And moreover, you're justified because these claims are justified a priori, right? Now, that's different from a claim, like suppose that the entire history, you're like a real creepo, and the entire history of every garment of clothing I have ever worn in my life, right? Can you, given all of this history, predict with absolute certitude, that is to say, claim to know what I'm going to wear tomorrow? Right? Of course not. Right? The only way you can know the color of the shirt I'm going to wear tomorrow is by seeing it. That is the only way. There's no way. Unlike tomorrow, you know that all triangles tomorrow on a perfect triangles on a Euclidean plane will have inner angles that sum to 180 degrees. Take it to the bank. Go to sleep. Rest well at night, knowing that has to be the case, right? But there's no way you can know that about the color of the shirt I'm going to wear tomorrow. Heck, I don't even know the color of the shirt I'm going to wear tomorrow, right? That's because in order to be able to make a knowledge claim of that sort, you have to have the relevant experience. That is, round about, say, noon. Well, hopefully I'm actually out of my PJs, but say by 8, you knock on the door and I come in, I'm like, hey, what's up? And you're like, it's red. And I go, huh? And then you walk away, and I'm very confused, right? So there are certain knowledge claims that can only be justified after you've had the relevant experience, right? Those are called those are justified a posteriori, right? So that's why when I said posteriori, it means after. This justification only comes after you've had the experience, whereas justification a priori means you were justified prior to any relevant experience at all. Here, give me one moment. I'm just going to pour the rest of this into a cup. Okay. So we've got a priori, a posteriori here on the Punnett square. We've got analytic, synthetic. Okay. So now that we know what those mean, Kant's going to just ask you to fill in all four squares, right? Is it possible to have analytic judgments that are justified a priori? Kant's going to say absolutely. In fact, it's necessary, right? You can't have an analytic judgment that isn't justified a priori. They have to. It's by definition, right? Okay. Now, another thing about a priori justification is because we're dealing with basically laws, mathematical laws, in the examples I've been using, or laws of logic. The reason the justification for the claim that all bachelors are unmarried males is true is because it's a I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but there's a logical necessity to it. You're basically saying A equals A. It just turns out that A on the one side, bachelor, is this word that sounds vaguely Greek. We actually don't know the etymology of it. And unmarried male, on the other hand, it ends up being two different words to equate to the same thing. But fundamentally, A equals A, and for various logical reasons, it turns out if A equals A, then A couldn't be anything else but A, in a sort of a strict logical sense. I'm not going to get to it. Anyway, so because we're dealing with either mathematical or logical laws, or just laws generally, laws, which cannot be abrogated, can't be broken, that's kind of the nature of a law, then it turns out that anything that is a priori is necessary. It can't be otherwise, right? This is the way math is, right? Because it's analytically true, it follows, of course, that it must be necessary, that the truths must be necessary. Okay, so analytic a priori, check that first box, absolutely, couldn't be otherwise. Let's hold off on synthetic a priori for a moment, because again, that's the one that Kant thinks Hume missed. What about analytic a posteriori? Seems impossible. It's just kind of a contradiction of terms for the reasons we'd suggested. If things are analytically true, then it turns out they have to be true by necessity. They couldn't be otherwise because they're fundamentally, they're sort of relying upon the law of identity, A equals A, this sort of thing. So it can't be the case that they're justified, there are any analytic truths that are justified a posteriori. It just couldn't. There's no way of it happening. It's not like if you know that someone says, "I'm a bachelor," and you go, "So you're unmarried, right?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I'm a bachelor," and you're like, "I'm gonna have to see the ring." Right? Do you ever wear a ring? No, you don't wear a ring. Okay. Do you mind if I interview some of your friends? Your family members just really need to. The only way I can know that because you say you're a bachelor, that follows that you're unmarried. The only way I can know that is if I interview, right? I mean, it's just not the way it works, right? You don't need any further. In fact, if you did interview them and they all said yes, it's not like you're like, oh, now I'm more certain, right, than this bum over here who just like worked it out by definition, right? Well, I don't know any more than this guy did regarding the question of whether this guy's unmarried. Right? So analytic a posteriori, put a big ol' X there, not possible. What about synthetic a posteriori? Yes, lots and lots and lots of claims that we have about the cosmos are such that the only way we can justify them is both by not merely analyzing the terms of the proposition, but actually having to go out and engage in field work, and then by definition, once I've engaged in that field work, right? Well, not by definition. That's not true at all. So scratch that. But by engaging in that field work, now I'm justified in having come to the conclusion. But without having engaged in that field work, I never would have otherwise been justified. Okay? Are you tracking so far? Okay. So now, so the example that Kant gives for a synthetic a posteriori claim, which I love. You just imagine Kant, who was a bachelor all of his life. You imagine him coming up with this conversation. This example. I wish we had like copies of the draft that he wrote this out on pen, because I bet you there are it's splattered with smeared ink from tear marks He says, some bachelors are lonely. It's horrible, right? Like, well, how do you know that some bachelors are lonely? It's certainly not in the definition of bachelor, right? It doesn't follow that just because you're unmarried, you're lonely. Just by definition, that doesn't follow. So it's a synthetic proposition. You have to bring the definition of loneliness, to sort of analyze it itself, understand what it means, and then bring it together by going out into the world and looking for bachelors. Hey, are you unmarried? And yeah. Are you lonely? No, yeah, I'm actually pretty good. And then you go to the next guy. Hey, are you unmarried? Yeah. Are you lonely? And he's like, no. Yeah. Okay. And then you're like, oh man, some bachelors are unmarried. Okay. Now, not only now can you say like, okay, some are, like by virtue of synthesizing, bringing together the proposition, bachelor and loneliness in a way that isn't just true by definition. But now you're justified in it only because you went out and did that research. So now you're justified in an a posteriori way. Okay, so what about synthetic a priori? Now, remember, Hume says that's impossible. That's just a misunderstanding of the way the mind works, or the way justification works, or things like this. Well, here's where Kant's going to answer as it were, solve the Humean problem. Here's how Kant is going to, on the one hand, say all that we can know things about the mind-independent world with certainty, what he calls apodictic. We can know them apodictically, which means deductively, more or less. We can prove them. And yet, acknowledge that we still need experience in order to come to this awareness. And so that's going to be the synthetic part, right? Going out, seeing things in the world, and synthesizing the terms of the proposition, while also the a priori part is being justified after having enough experience, no longer needing the sort of experience that was initially required in order to be justified in making claims about the future, or sort of categorical or universal claims. Okay, so it's synthetic insofar as it does require, as it were, field research. You do need to go out and have experience in order to form the proposition, in order to make it coherent. But once you've done that, then you can know with certitude, because it turns out these are justified in an a priori way, that you don't need any more field research in order to know that it is the case. You can be certain that this proposition is true, was always true, will always be true by necessity. You can be certain of it, right? So you can see here, that's where Hume just would have denied that as a possibility, right? And Kant's going to say, well, no, actually, you just failed to make this distinction that I'm making. Okay, so what are certain things that are known synthetically? They're synthetic judgments, and yet are justified in an a priori way. Well, actually, it turns out mathematics is that way. So Kant doesn't think mathematical propositions are justified merely by analysis. In other words, he doesn't think they're true by definition. This is one of the things he disagrees with Hume on. And although he does agree with Hume that they're justified in an a priori way. Again, he understands that once you understand the definition of a triangle as a three-sided object whose inner angles sum to 180 degrees on a Euclidean plane, once you understand that definition, it's not true by definition, he thinks. You actually have to do some work, you have to engage with experience. But once you have the definition, it is justified, he agrees with Hume, in an a priori way. You don't have to go out tomorrow and look at triangles to make sure that their inner angles still sum to 180 degrees, that they only have three sides, etc. So it still is justified in an a priori way, but he disagrees with Hume that they're not analytic, which is on this side of the Punnett square, but they are synthetic. Okay, so mathematical claims are among them. What are other claims that would be among them? That every effect has a cause, right? So he's going to disagree with Hume about causation. He's going to agree with Hume that we only come to the concept of causation by virtue of experience. Remember, Hume thinks we have a concept of causation by virtue of experience. Repeated experience, where A always follows B in a law-like way. So, and then the mind associates these experiences along that third association, the associative category of causal relations, cause and effect, right? That's Hume's position. So Hume thinks, of course, in order to form the belief of causation, we have to have experiences, right? So Kant's going to agree with that. That's why it's synthetic. We do have to have experience to come to form judgments about causation. But again, he thinks that once you learn about the laws, very particularly physical laws that obtain in the cosmos, then you can know tomorrow just the same way that you know today after experience or whatnot. Actually, you probably learned this a long time ago, that when a billiard ball hits another billiard ball on the board, or on the table, that the second billiard ball is going to move as a result. So causal relations end up being synthetic and a priori as well. So this is why this upper right-hand square on the Punnett square is so important, because Kant is fundamentally going to say this is where Hume failed to make a distinction. And failing to make this distinction will lead you to a type of Humean skepticism. If it is the case that all synthetic judgments can only be justified in an a posteriori way, well then you can't know with certainty anything that the senses give you, right? Because it turns out, unlike a priori cognition, a posteriori cognition is not necessary, right? Because it's not grounded by logical or mathematical laws or anything like that, right? So he thinks if you fail to make this distinction, if you fail to allow for the possibility of synthetic a priori, this upper left-hand or upper right-hand corner of the square, then you are led to Humean skepticism. But if we make this distinction and if we can justify it, that is to say, if we can show not only that it's necessary in order, but hey, actually, it turns out Hume was wrong. I mean, we have to make this distinction because the evidence demands it, or the reasoning demands it. Then not only can we secure the claim that all knowledge comes only through the senses, but we can also secure the claim that this is necessary, that these propositions or judgments are necessary, couldn't be otherwise, and as such, when they're made tomorrow, they will be as true as when they're made today. And I can go to bed at night knowing that that's the case. I don't have to wait till tomorrow and wake up and go out and determine by field research whether causal relations exist, that sort of thing. So that's how Kant's going to do it. Okay, so this is where I ended the first lecture, and then then I was going to go later on, but I'm just going to combine these very quickly now. So we're already reaching almost 40 minutes. So okay, so how does Kant do this? Well, first, one thing he's got to do is justify the claim that mathematical propositions are synthetic, right? Whereas Hume thought, again, that they just equate to one another, right? All mathematical propositions fundamentally are tautologically true by definition. So how does Kant justify this claim that that's not the case, that in fact mathematical propositions are synthetically true, that we're taking propositions and combining them, synthesizing them together by recourse to experience. Okay. Well, some of it I've kind of basically already said, right? Kant's going to say, so take arithmetic. He uses the example of 7 plus 5. He's going to say, there's nothing about 7 plus 5 equals 12 that is true by definition. How do I know? Because, say I take the 12 part out of the equation. So I have 7 plus 5 equals question mark. What could you write in there, right? Does it have to be 12? If it's true by definition, then it would have to be 12 or something else that would ultimately be true by definition. So you couldn't do something like 12 plus 5 equals 4 times 3 and go, ha, gotcha, Hume. Right? Because Hume would say, well, 4 times 3 is just another way of saying 12, right? So instead of now you have 3 or 2 equal signs instead of just 1. So that wouldn't work. But you could say something like this. So another way of thinking of this, one way of writing 7 plus 5 is writing 7 and 5. In fact, this is the way mathematics was written for a long time in the ancient medieval world. It would be written out as not, you didn't have this plus sign, that's a little bit later. You would have 7 and 5. So what if I had 7 and 5 are instead of equals, right? So we're getting rid of all the symbols together. 7 and 5 are question mark. What could you answer there? Numbers? That's a true answer, right? If you say 7 and 5 are numbers, who's going to be like, no, false, right? No, They're numbers. That's a true answer, right? And there's no way numbers redounds by definition to 12, right? So, 12 is a number, but the word number isn't only 12 in the way that A could only be A, something like that. So, I don't know. Kanye West and the Kardashian girl, they seem to name their kids weird things. So maybe 7 and 5 are Kanye and Kim's children, twin children's names, right? Maybe they named their kids 7 and 5. I don't know, right? That could be true, right? How do I know that would be true? Well, I'd go and find it and be like, hey, Kanye, what's up? And he's like, who are you? I'm like, it's not important right now. You just had twins, right? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, 7 and 5, that's their names? He's like, yes. And I go, see, I told you, 7 and 5, that's their kids, right? Or more likely, he'd be like, no, and I'm calling the cops. I'm like, whoa, okay, right? Anyway, but you get the idea, right? So 7 and 5 are. Kant says it doesn't follow by definition that 12 is the obvious and only answer, right? What makes it 12 is that we are synthesizing 7 and 5, the concepts of 7 and 5, and the concept of 12. It seems kind of obvious, right? Given the examples I've just given, we're synthesizing them in a way, specifically in an arithmetic way, right? So we're not just putting the numbers together, but we're saying, hey, given certain laws of mathematics, of arithmetic, then if you've got 7 plus 12 on this side of the equation, then the other side of the equation has to be 12, or something that fundamentally redounds by definition of 12, like 4 times 3 or 20 minus 8 or whatever, right? But the synthesis is in bringing together the term in the proposition 12 and 7 plus 5 and an arithmetic relationship. So you're actually bringing a lot together. It's a lot more than just definitions that are true. Okay. And he uses other examples. I'd give you the example of the triangle. No, I don't want to get into it because it'll just take a little bit too long. It's a little more complicated, but it just turns out he thinks all mathematical, or at least any higher math than 1 equals 1, which is an equation that does turn out to be analytically true. So there might be some math or 1 equals 1. It'd have to be something really simple like that. Anyway, he thinks this is true for both mathematics, for arithmetic and geometry and so forth. Now, once you make that particular synthesis, the synthesis of 7 and 5 on the one hand and 12 on the other, with this understanding that we're talking about these terms in an arithmetic way using the laws of arithmetic, well, now you know, because the laws, once you understand what 7 is and what plus is and 5 is and equals is and 12 is, and that these terms are all being used according to set laws of math, which you had to learn through experience, but once you learn them and you understand that they are laws, then you know tomorrow 7 plus 5 will equal 12. You can be certain of it. You don't have to wake up tomorrow and get your abacus out because you have an abacus, right? Or get your calculator out or do it longhand, whatever. You can know it with certitude. So it's a priori. It's justified. I can know tomorrow without any further research that 7 plus 5 will equal 12, right? Okay, so that's what makes it a priori. So now we have this possibility for claims which we can only come to know through experience, that is synthetically, but can be justified a priori, that is without additional experience. Once the initial experience or series of experiences gives us the understanding, that's it. Now we're justified in knowing into perpetuity, or without further justification, that we know that this is the case. Okay, so what is this? How does this open the door for knowing that the external world exists, right? Well, because what Kant's going to fundamentally do here is he's going to show that this isn't true merely for math, but it's actually true for experience as such. In other words, the very possibility of experience, at least the sort of experience we have, necessitates that there are certain a priori laws in effect already. and I hinted at this in my last lecture. What are the things that must already be there? That is to say, in an a priori way, they're necessary in order for us to have the experiences that we have at all. Well, space and time, right? You cannot have an experience that didn't happen at some location and in time, at a certain point, right? In other words, any experience you have logically necessitates that it's a meaningful question to say, where did it happen and when did it happen? Right? He's going to take that as true, as a necessary truth, just by virtue of having the experiences we have. Because, well, I mean, beyond the arguments he's going to give, just try to reflect on it, as I asked you last time. What would it mean to have an experience that didn't take place at a certain time? Right? I mean, it just kind of, I don't know how to even make it clearer than just asking that question. What if someone denied that, well, no, I had an experience, but it wasn't yesterday, and it wasn't now, and it won't be tomorrow, and it wasn't sometime earlier today, and it's not going to be sometime later today, right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense, right? All experiences seem to occur at a particular time, right? And likewise in a particular space, right? So, beyond mere reflection, though, he does give an argument for it, and he's going to give the argument for from math. Taking geometry, for instance, he says, imagine, as it were, among the simplest concepts that one can. They'd be something like geometric shapes or bodies, right? Definition of a triangle: three-sided body whose inner angles sum to 180 degrees on a Euclidean plane. Now, take an equilateral triangle. So all three of the legs are identical to one another. They're same length. Now, I can imagine this as a concept. I don't have to draw it. I can just imagine, yes, it turns out if I've done the work, if I've had the proper education, that I can imagine a triangle that has three legs which are all of the same length, and they're all touching, each leg's touching at least two other legs. And I know that the inner angles are going to sum to 180 degrees. In this case, they're going to all be 60. Now, because of that, all of the legs being equilateral, all the legs being the same size, the same length, are only distinguished by virtue of where they're located in space on the Euclidean plane. That's the only thing that distinguishes them from one another, right? So Kant wants to suggest that even the concept, now this has nothing to do with actually going out and looking at the world now. Now we're sort of away from the realm of experience as such. We're just thinking in a completely theoretical or abstract way. You cannot conceive of an equilateral triangle. The very conception of the very idea itself necessitates along with it a concept of space. Right? It just, you can't think of geometry at the purely abstract level without already having space involved in the equation. And so he thinks that even at the most basic abstract level, rational level, that's important. We're not talking about looking at the world as such anymore. We're just, as it were, receding into the purely mental, rational world. And what is more purely mental and rational than mathematics, right? This is why you don't have math labs. This is right. These things ought to be justified merely by analyzing, not merely analyzing not in the terms of true or false by definition, but merely by working out the inferences from definitions, and from the definitions to what you learned here, and then from what you learned here, and so forth, moving along progressively in a synthetic way. Still, you do have to learn the laws, you have to hear them and work them out, but once you learn them, then there's no recourse to experience at all, right? And you can do this in a purely abstract, rational way, and even then, you have to always and already have a concept of space. You can't do geometry apart from that. You can't think geometrically apart from the concept of space. And yet you don't have any direct experience with space. What is space by definition, right? And here, again, I'd go into more detail here. If we were in class, Kant is engaging in what at this point had been a 150-year or so debate between the nature of space itself, between, on the one hand, Newton, on the other hand, Leibniz, there's this great debate, and in some sense it still exists, about the definition of space itself. And in a way, Kant's entering into that debate. But for our purposes, you can just suggest space is not something that we experience as such. You don't see space. Space is whatever that medium or whatever separating, maybe not medium, but it's what separates bodies. It's among the ways we distinguish, say, the three bodies making up an equilateral triangle, namely three identical sides. The only way we distinguish, side AB, line AB, from line BC, it should have been AB, I suppose, and AC. How do we make the distinction between AB and AC? The only way we make that distinction is by virtue of their place. This one's here, this one's here, right? And yet we don't see it. We don't see space as such. It's just a way of distinguishing bodies in this way, right? So Kant thinks at the most abstract level, space, at least with regard to bodies, this is why he uses geometry, space is already there and must be there in order to have any geometric concepts at all, and yet it's not a part of the experience as such. Okay? Or it's not a part of the thought. It's not given to us the way the laws, again, you had to have experience to learn these laws of triangles, but you don't in the same way have an experience of space. It turns out that in order to have those experiences at all, space already has to be present. And he shows this by recourse to a purely rational, abstract example whereby the concept of space is already also present, namely purely abstract geometry. The concept of space is necessary in order to make the concept of triangle possible at all. Okay? So as it were, it's prior to, a priori, it has a priority, the concept of space has a priority to any geometric definition or law at all. Okay? And he does the same thing with arithmetic. In order to synthesize 7 and 5 are, 12. In order to make the synthesis, 7 in a specific understanding of the word, and in a specific understanding of the word, 5 in a specific understanding of the word, R in a specific understanding of the word, 12 in a specific understanding of the word, namely arithmetic understanding of all these words, and then synthesizing them together, actually carrying out if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, plus 2 more, well then I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? All of that, even when you do it really quickly, like I'm sure all of you math whizzes do, you hear 7 plus 5 equals, and everyone's 12, it can happen so quickly that you don't notice it, but nonetheless, there's a little bit of time there. That synthesis takes just a little bit of time. And you can see why that has to be the case. The very nature of something that is synthetic is that at one point, the propositions were dispersed. That is to say, they were not brought together or synthesized. And then at another moment, however quickly, they were synthesized. So here you see a change from a position of no synthesis to a position of synthesis. And whenever you have a change, there's got to be time involved. That just seems to be a necessity of the understanding of change or synthesis or anything at all, right? So in order for something to be synthetic at all, it turns out you have to have time already and necessarily as a part of the very concept. And as with geometry, in fact, arithmetic's probably even more abstract, even less tied to the physical world than geometry. Arithmetic is. So those are Kant's arguments for the claim that space and time, for us to be able not only to have experiences at all, but to really already be able to reason at all, right? To be able to engage in these sort of paradigmatic, abstract reasonings they have to already be there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do the things we can do. Remember, I used this term last time. This is a transcendental argument, right? He's looking at the world and he's saying, how is it that we're capable of having experiences like we have at all? What conditions have to already be in place? And he says, well, at least for geometry, which is incredibly abstract, you have to already have space there. In order for arithmetic to be carried out, which is incredibly abstract, already time has to be there. And now, not only is that the case, certainly at the abstract level, it's the case at the really abstract level, then it must also, how much more so, in fact, must it also be the case in order for us to have the experiences we have at all. So here's a case, then, where I know that the very nature of experience, moving from this pure rationalization, geometry and arithmetic, then to less abstract, more concrete, having experiences that I have, in order for me to have any experience at all, I already have to have within me concepts of space and time, and yet I don't experience space and time as such. So that's why I said last time, space and time are present in all experiences, and yet they're not the objects of experience. The objects of experience are the things you experience. My voice, my body, seeing it, the taste of food as you put it upon your mouth, the hardness of a body as you slap it, a table or something like that. Those are the objects of the experience. Well, not the hardness, actually. It's the thing itself that you're feeling, the thing itself that you're tasting, the thing itself that you're hearing. Those are the objects of experience. Now, something can be present in experience and yet not be an object of it. That is to say, it's there and yet you're not sensing it. What are those things at the most fundamental level? Space and time for Kant. Okay, so you can already see how this is going to work, and this is where we're going to stop because it gets really complicated really quickly. But you can see how this is opening the door for Kant, because now we've got these things that have to be there, and yet we can't sense them as such. And because he thinks he's proved this with space and time, now we have a possibility of saying, look, I'm not claiming Hume. Hume, you and I agree that in order to know anything at all, we have to have experience. And yet, by going through this analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori distinction, and making this distinction that Hume hasn't made, Kant says, yet I can also maintain that I can know certain things about reality. I can make claims about reality, and not just reality now, but reality tomorrow and 1,000 years into the future and so forth. I can make claims about reality that about things I would otherwise not experience according to the five senses, right? In other words, I can know that there are certain spatial temporal relations. Without being able, I can know that space and time are a thing. In fact, they have to be, without being able to experience either one at all. Even though I only come to learn about this through experience. It's only after having so many experiences and sort of being able to show, geez Louise, they're always in time and space, and then using this more abstract argument with geometry and arithmetic and everything, and going, okay, well then it turns out that even the most abstract thinking at all requires time and space in order to carry on. And so if that's the case for the most abstract, then it must absolutely be the case for the less abstract, the more concrete, that is to say, the things that are related to me by my senses. So what he's then going to call these time and space are pure intuitions, because they are themselves present in experience, but they're not mixed with experience. They're the conditions for experience. The experiences we have, Kant calls intuitions, and I went through this last time. Okay. So what you're going to see then, and this is where we stop, but what Kant's going to continue on with is the claim that things like cause and effect, things like the existence of bodies through time and the continued existence and things like that, he will give similar, although very different, and he categorizes these things differently too. He doesn't call cause and effect a pure intuition, right? There are categories of thought. But again, this is why I won't get into it. It's very complicated. But the idea is that it's the same kind of basic move. He's going to suggest that, yes, David, I agree with you. Cause and effect are not the sorts of things I can see, and you're probably right that induction isn't going to justify it either. But what it turns out that when we look at the way the mind works, in order for it to be able to have the experiences that it has, we already have to presuppose that these ways of thinking are true. Causal relations simply have to be true in order for us to have the experiences we have at all. Okay? So that's going to be his circumvention of Humean skepticism. Now, I will say very briefly what makes Kant so difficult for a lot of people, beyond the fact that he's a horrible writer and he's really stupid smart, and philosophy's tough anyway, right? And so despite all of this, Kant has to come to the conclusion that if it is the case that things like space and time, cause and effect, and so forth, are fundamentally a result of the way our minds are wired, in other words, it's already there prior to any experience. Again, you can't have an experience without space and time. What would that mean? So that means the mind presupposes space and time as a condition for us to be able to have an experience at all. So what that means, though, it follows from this, that if you ask Kant, well, do space and time exist in a world outside of the mind? Kant's going to say, I don't know. How can I say? All I can say is that I know that we have experiences of a certain sort, and that those experiences are conditioned by our mind, and that our mind makes sense of those experiences by virtue of space and time and causation and existence and all these sorts of things. I know that, and that's how I can know tomorrow if I throw a pen up in the air and, we're not in a space shuttle or whatever, we're just in normal conditions. If I throw a pen up in the air, the pen will not only fall back down, it will fall down according to a formula, 9.6 meters squared time cubed, I forget the exact, right? He says, I'm going to know that. But if you ask me whether that would be the case if human minds didn't exist at all, in other words, is the world considered without human experience at all the same as it is as we experience it, he's going to suggest I can't say, right? Because all I've learned is that we can preserve these laws of nature and these laws of mathematics and so forth because the mind is what is, as it were, conditioning us. It's doing a lot of the work, sort of like Hume's association of ideas. It's doing a lot of interpretive work already. It's there at the moment of the experience. It's not there afterwards trying to make sense of the experience. It's conditioning, it's giving form to the experience as such, right? Now that sounds crazy, right? It's like the Kantian system forces us to say, on the one hand, he wants to say, hey, I've overcome skepticism. On the other hand, he wants to say, but yet I can't tell you what the world outside the mind is actually like, right? How is that possible, right? It seems like a contradiction. How have we gotten around skepticism at all? And I'll sort of leave you with this. Kant's going to ask, okay, you are asking me, look at this tree and it's green, right? You guys know this picture I draw with the stick man and the tree and everything. You're asking me whether the tree is green. And we all go, yeah, of course it's green. And now you want to say, but is it green even if nobody's there to see it? Okay. Kant's going to say, what does that even mean? In other words, to say that something is green is to say that it has a property such that when I engage with it with my eyes, it appears to me as green. So if I take my eyes and every other person's eyes away, and then you say, is the tree green? He's going to say, green for whom? Right? If there's nobody there to see it, it has no color at all, because color is necessarily, according to Kant and frankly a lot of people since down to the present day, color is necessarily an interaction of our sense organs and our minds with the object itself. So absent that important part of the equation, that is our sense organs and our minds, asking what it looks like to us, and yet we're not there, is, you see how that's just kind of a meaningless question for Kant? It's just a confused question. He just doesn't think it makes any sense, right? And we use examples like this all the time. I mean, dogs are colorblind. Does a tree look green to a dog? Well, no, it doesn't. They don't have the cones, right? They're physically unequipped to be able to say, oh, that tree is green, right? Same clear dogs see trees, right? They see something, right? But they don't categorize it as tree. They just don't have the minds to even do that. We can go even more simpler. Think of bees, right? Bees see in the ultraviolet. We see in the color spectrum. Bees see ultraviolet. And yet bees are attracted to things that we regard as yellow and pink. If humans weren't here, would bees still be attracted to yellow and pink flowers? Yes. Would those flowers look yellow and pink to the bees? No. Bees see only ultraviolet. Yellow and pink fall within the color spectrum. So if human beings aren't here, does it make any sense to say that there are yellow and pink things? Kant's going to say, well, no, because yellow and pink things are, at least, presuming we're the only animals that see yellow and pink, and I don't know whether that's the case or not, but you get the idea. If we are the only animals, and then you say, so are they still yellow and pink apart from it? And you go, no, that doesn't make any sense, because yellow and pink arise from an interaction between objects and our sense organs and our minds all working together. So that's how Kant's going to kind of still say, now, are you asking me whether tomorrow this yellow and pink flower, or this yellow or pink flower, will be either yellow or pink? Well, if I know botany enough, and if I can predict the weather well enough tomorrow, then I can say yes. And I can know that that's the case. I can know it. But are you asking me if all human beings were suddenly disapparated from the world, and there's nothing in the world that can see along the color spectrum, or at least the color spectrum whereby yellow and pink fall? If you're asking me in that world whether these flowers are yellow and pink, Kant's going to say, I just don't know what that means. And if you go, what I'm suggesting is I close my eyes, I imagine a world in which nobody exists, and there are these two flowers there, and I can imagine them as yellow and pink, well, how would you respond to that, right? And what would Kant say? He'd be like, you're imagining yourself seeing them. You think you imagine yourself as getting rid of everybody and imagining flowers with nobody looking at them, but in your mind, in your imagination, you're still looking at them. So yes, and even in your mind and your imagination, they still look yellow and pink. But you know what? That proves my point, that my being Kant. That proves the point, because the concept of a flower, say a yellow and pink, this particular flower, requires, even at the most abstract level, that is abstracted from all physical properties you're actually seeing, just considered in the mind as such, you can't imagine a flower without some color, right? You can't even imagine a body without, at least a three-dimensional body, without some color, right? Even if it's black or white or whatever, right? So for Kant, he's going to suggest you're actually proving my point. So this doesn't entail skepticism, according to Kant, because it just means that you're asking a question or expecting something that it turns out upon closer analysis is nonsensical. That doesn't make me Kant, he would say. That doesn't make me a skeptic. That just means I've understood, and I've shown you, I've given arguments for the claim that the mind engages with experience, shaping it, forming it, and in a necessary way from which we can never extrapolate or extricate the world as such, right? So what is the world actually like without human minds? We have no clue. No clue. He calls that the noumenal world. But what we have absolute certainty about, at least along scientific lines, rational lines, and so forth, we have absolute certainty about the workings of the natural world that we experience, which he calls the phenomenal world. Phenomenal because it's given to us through phenomena experience. Okay, that's Kant, and I did it in like an hour and 10 minutes. I was able to condense what would have been about 8 to 9 hours of lecture into about an hour and 50 minutes. So, okay, guys, that is it. I'm going to see whether this will upload, and it is Sunday, Easter Sunday, about 5 o'clock. So we'll see if this uploads, and if it doesn't, like I said, I give up. I don't know. You win, world. Well done. So I will be recording. The next recording will be Reed. I'll probably only do one, maybe two on him, and I will record that tomorrow. It should be up either tomorrow or Tuesday. yeah, and again, I'm really sorry this is late, and like I said, I'm going to upload some supplementary material so that you have something to work with, like that Punnett square particularly. Very confused. It's very difficult to imagine all this without it. I know I spoke quickly. I apologize for that. Hope you guys are well. Hope you're staying warm and certainly COVID-free, and look forward to, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. I guess that's really depressing, but you know what? I look forward to the possibility of maybe seeing you again. So hang in there, guys.